To crosstalk the Syrian civil war, I'm joined by my guest, Richard Murphy in New York. He is a former U.S. career ambassador to Syria and currently an adjunct scholar at the Middle East Institute in Washington. In San Francisco, we have Scott Bennet. He is a former U.S. Army psychological warfare officer and counterterrorism analyst. And in London, we cross to Kapil Komireddi. He is an Indian journalist who's reported from the Middle East. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules. In fact, that means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much encourage it. Richard, if I go to you first in New York, you were ambassador to Syria. How would you assess the Obama administration's Syria policy? Because we're getting to a point of more volatility, and we're going to discuss the real and alleged role that Russia may be taking to involve itself greater in settling this conflict. Richard, go ahead.
Well, I think 4 years ago, the Obama administration looked at the quick changes in certain Arab countries like Tunisia, like Egypt, and assumed that Syria fell into the same category, that the Assad regime would be blown away by the winds of what the West called the Arab Spring. That was a wrong assessment. It underestimated the support, whether from fear of change on the part of the Syrian people or basic loyalty to the regime. And since then, the policy, frankly, has been, in my opinion, confused.
Okay, Scott, if I can go to you in San Francisco, a lot of people would say that's an understatement, confused. Go ahead.
Well, yeah, I think he nailed the key words, though. Confusion and fear is stricken the Middle East, and it's particularly stricken Europe right now. The stakes have all changed, Peter. With this mass refugee foreign person invasion into Europe, you have Germany and all the European countries going into confusion and fear about what's coming. And like I said, you could have a meltdown similar to the Iraqi meltdown when the U.S. went in. They were happy for a while, but then they went into complete anarchy and bitterness and resentment. And the same could happen to Europe. This is a great oppority for President Putin to take a page Scott, out of President Ronald Reagan's book and be a positive person.
Yeah, but Scott, if you read the Washington Post, this is an opportunity for the U.S. and its allies to again attempt toppling the legitimate regime in Syria. I mean, you've learned the right lessons, but the administration apparently hasn't. You want to continue? Go ahead.
Of course, the administration is a dismal failure. It's an apocalyptic failure. It is arrogance at the highest point, and it's not reflective of the American people. The American people do not want to displace Syria. The American people do not want to displace Assad. They want order and stability and safety. They've been propagandized into thinking that Assad is somehow going to go in and annihilate Texas or Washington. That's BS. That's nonsense. But you now have a dangerous position where Obama and these clowns on Congress, Capitol Hill, are so arrogantly obsessed with U.S. policy becoming a law of nations that they aren't smart and prudent and cool-headed enough to step back and say, let's look at the lessons learned from our failure in Iraq and create a stable environment in Syria. First and foremost, not about democracy, not about self-representation, but about stability and order, and work with Russia and Syria.
Let me go to Kapil. In London, you know, one of the things I find just amazing is that on this program for years we've run out of titles to title this program, Crosstalk, when we deal with Syria. We've used every single combination you can imagine. And this conflict continues on, and there's this opportunity. We had it 2 years ago. The U.S. and its allies walked away from it in peace negotiations. Now we have this opportunity where Russia is saying it would work with an international coalition. If it would or not, we don't know, but it's proposed it anyway. And still there's this resistance in Western capitals. I mean, Hollande says now he's going to take over and start bombing. But, you know, the difference is, and I want our viewers to know this, is that Assad, the legitimate leader of Syria, has asked Russia to come in and help it. Okay? The U.S. illegally, with no United Nations Security Council resolution, bombs that country on a regular basis without the permission of that government. That's the difference between Russia and the United States when it deals with Syria. Go ahead.
I think Ambassador Murphy nailed it very perfectly when he said that the confusion began 4 years ago, and it is what the problem is. We haven't moved away from that confusion. We keep digging the hole deeper and deeper. We began by saying that there should be regime change, and we've learnt that there cannot be regime change. There is no legal basis for regime change, and also if you change the regime, who will fill the vacuum? We don't know that. David Cameron in Britain has said that he wants to defeat ISIS and overthrows Assad, what does he expect to replace Assad with? He has no idea about that. So this is basically cloud cuckoo land.
Okay, Richard, that's a very sophisticated term, but I think it's probably appropriate at this point. Richard, I mean, shouldn't the administration just, eat crow a little bit and say, okay, we don't like Assad, but let's work with the Russians and other regional players and have a transition where we get something different here, and everybody takes a step back, everybody takes a breath, and negotiate this end of this civil war. It is possible, but again, there seem to be certain players that are so resistant to new ideas or anybody else's idea but their own. Go ahead, Richard.
Well, let me say this. We have not gone into a state of mind which is more arrogant. I think we're more modest, more uncertain, and President Obama has made it clear he was not reelected on a platform to get involved in another war in the Middle East. But that said, we don't know quite what to do, because the factions, of which there are now several hundred in Syria, have not been able to come to common ground. We've encouraged that. We thought with the Syrian National Council that there were signs they were beginning to reach a coordinated position, but they haven't, at least they haven't yet succeeded in that. But I don't agree that we are today more arrogant in our policy. We are uncertain, and we are more,
I'm terribly sorry,
more
I beg your
modest
pardon,
in our
but
aims.
if I may...
All right, Kapil, that's the point. Jump in, go ahead. Yeah. That's the point of the program.
Sorry,
go ahead.
If I may just interject, I think America is very complicit in the chaos in Syria. It has armed rebels. Its closest ally in the region, Saudi Arabia, has pumped weapons into the region, and America has done nothing to prevent that. So American modesty, it may look modest from Washington, but for the nations exposed to the hard edges of American policy, it looks anything but.
Okay, Scott, I mean, you can go even further. I mean, you have Qatar, you have Turkey, you have Israel, you have Saudi Arabia, other Gulf countries that are fueled this on money, training, moral support. I mean, come on. I mean, there's no modesty right here. There's an enormous amount of arrogance. But the thing is you keep trying the same policy and you don't get the result you want. That should tell you that you should try something else. Scott.
Yeah, well, you're exactly right. There is no modesty. There's nothing but arrogance, and it's self-destructive arrogance. And the destructive party is going to be, unfortunately, Europe. Europe is falling apart at the seams as we speak. Now, that could be either the fall of Rome into a dark ages, or it could be a renaissance of Europe into the stronger pre-Schengen European Union, where every country is its own country again. And I think Russia could step in and say, we are European. America is not. America is between two oceans. We represent the solidarity and protection of Europe. Let us come aside and be your ally and first control this exodus into Europe. And I think the Eastern European countries, the post-Soviet countries, are going to take lead, Peter, because they've got the intestinal fortitude that Germany and France and Italy seem to totally lack. The Eastern European post-Soviet countries, I think, are going to step up and redefine Europe, and hopefully it'll be a renaissance. But this silliness about the U.S. not having a role is absolutely wrong. We have financed this operation. I saw the money trail, and I wrote a report on it and sent it to 150 congressmen and senators, and they all covered it up and did nothing. I saw the Swiss banks. I saw the Abdullah Aziz and the Saudi Arabians and the Qataris and the Kuwaitis. I saw the checks. I saw the money. And it outraged me, and it outraged all the special operations Army guys that I work with, because we said, why aren't we putting out these fires? And the answer was because they're defense contracts. Booz Allen Hamilton, which was my employer, they live like parasites off of these wars. And that offends some of those of us who've joined the war to finish it and go home. But unfortunately, America is fast becoming a myopic defense contractor country that is looking to continue these operations, and the chaos is causing all of this radioactive human shrapnel to avalanche into Europe. The traffickers who are taking them into Europe have said, quote, they will dominate Europe. We, the gypsy people who are pushing these people into Europe, they're going to dominate Europe. That means it's going to be a slow invasion force, and the only answer to that is to stop the mass exodus, redistribute it, control it, and set it back to their point of origins or to these other Middle Eastern countries.
Let me ask Richard a question before we go to the break here. Richard, I mean, I don't see Washington taking much responsibility for this migration refugee problem whatsoever. Do you think the U.S. should be, step up and say, we've spent billions and billions of dollars for regime change in this part of the world, but we don't pay much money for refugees? What do you think about that?
Well, we're paying a lot of money. It's not that. We're being very hesitant to accept the refugees, concerned about terrorists entering the country under the guise of refugees. You hear the same reactions in some European capitals, of course, as well. But the idea that the defense contractors are running foreign policy is a tempting one. It's an oversimplification. It is a potent factor and probably more powerful than
I was there.
But,
I saw. That's exactly what they do.
Okay, Kapil, I'd like to go back to you in London. Barack Obama said recently, quote, Russia's strategy of backing the Syrian government against ISIS is doomed to failure. Why would the president assume that? His policies have gotten nowhere. Go ahead.
It's the rivalry. It's the old rivalry with Russia. There are so many people in Washington and here in London, when they hear the name of Russia, something happens to them. And I come from India. I don't share the same hostility toward Russia. The general view should be no country should intervene in another country's affairs. And America, sadly, has breached that sacred understanding, that sacred covenant. And that example, that precedent set by NATO and the United States in Kosovo has repeatedly been exploited by other countries, and it will continue to be exploited by other countries. And coming back to Syria, if you remove Assad, who are you going to replace Assad with? Does Obama have a person in mind? Is there a group that will take over Syria? There's nobody there. And this is playing to the galleries. This is playing to the right-wing galleries in America to talk tough to Russia. But in reality, America's policy is an absolute failure in Syria, and it's causing all this misery and suffering. It's something we can't run away from.
Okay.
And it's not anti-American to say that.
Okay, Richard, it's just, I think Kapil put it really well. I mean, when Russia is mentioned, particularly in this context, I mean, people kind of lose their mind or go into some kind of unreality. I mean, this is, number one, I mean, Russia's been aligned in helping the regime in Assad way, way before, and his father, way before this conflict started. Russia's consistently sent some types of arms, spare parts. None of this is new. Advisors, none of this is new. But if you read the main newspapers in the U.S., it's like a huge, huge story. And it's not. It's not. It's a non-story. And then President Putin says that they want to help the Syrian government fight ISIS. I mean, what's wrong with that? Go ahead, Richard.
I think that the comment that the Putin policy is doomed is based on the assumption that it's going to give a confidence to the regime in Damascus that it can win, that the chances of a military victory are running higher than they have been, say, for this past year. And increased militarization isn't going to get us any closer
Richard,
to negotiation.
Who's militarized this over the last 4 years? It hasn't been Russia. It's been the West. It's been its allies. That's unbelievable. You could say that. Russia's military help to the Assad regime has been consistent for years. Look at the contracts. Who's upping the ante? Who's been upping the ante for years? It's amazing you can say that. I'm sorry, my friend, but it's an amazing statement you could say that. We're not, so Russia's not emboldening the Assad regime.
I totally disagree with that. I think the Assad regime is banking on the long run we are going to prevail. That's what
well, there's nothing wrong with that. What's wrong with that?
The President of Syria's opinion that?
What are the choices? Richard, what are the choices?
I just don't think it's going to work.
So they should just surrender and be slaughtered.
That's what
Washington wants. Surrender and you'll be slaughtered. There'll be ethnic cleansing. That's what will happen, and you know it. That regime will fight to its very end because of the people it's fighting, and now you have ISIS as a result of a failed policy in Iraq. I mean, if I were Assad and his people, I would be really hunkering down, and that's what they're doing. It's logical. It's rational. Okay, Scott, you want to jump in?
Well, I would just say you're right, Peter, on the analysis of Syria fighting to the death, because they're going to be slaughtered if they don't fight to the death. The question is it in Europe's best interest for Assad to stay? I think absolutely it is. Every European country should say, our objective is to protect our own citizens, our own family, our own national sovereignty. And to do that, we have to have a strong regime and personality to control the exodus of these refugees and these war victims of the U.S. hegemonic wars. Now, as bad as the wars are, and as sad as we are that the U.S. has gone on this insane route and never finished the wars properly, we have to contain the damage so that it doesn't infect Europe and destabilize and destroy Europe. I don't want to see refugees going into Europe drinking water bottles that the liberal left peace activists give them, and then throw down that water bottle and grab the European by the throat and say, surrender your wife and children. This is now the dominion of our new Islamic Europe state. That's what Europeans are very concerned about. And the only people that will give them stability
the refugees coming into Europe
the
are
Russian
not going to grab your wife and children.
Let's go to Kapil here, right here. Let's go to Kapil. Go ahead. Landon, go ahead.
I'm terribly sorry. I must disagree with that characterization of refugees as a menace, as a potential threat to Europe. I don't see
They're not refugees. Some of them are, and some of them are war activists going in to destabilize Europe. Don't make that mistake.
That's just a very appalling characterization. We've just had in this country.
They're doing it to the Yazidi women. They're doing it to the Yazidis.
We've just had an election in this country, and a very fine man called Jeremy Corbyn has been elected, and he's trying to change the language we use in talking about refugees and talking about international affairs. And I think we need to evolve a more mature vocabulary than to demonize people who've come in desperation. I think, and also in agreement with you, all I will say is that you don't resolve the problem of refugees by bombing countries. You don't bomb your way to peace.
No, and you don't resolve the problem by letting a whole mass exodus of refugees, some of which are terrorists, come into your country and totally take over the country.
You give aid to people in need.
You control the borders of your own country.
All right, let me go to Richard. Let me go to Richard in New York, gents. Let me go to Richard in New York. I mean, Richard, you just heard the exchange there, right? You just heard the exchange right there, and it seems to me, and I'm appealing to our good natures, here, all of our good natures here. And don't you think now is a time for Washington and Moscow, at least on this one issue, to say they can work together, have some kind of timeline, some kind of transition where people, and we talked before the program, before we recorded this program, maybe we have to be more open-minded in what kind of borders are going to be there. What I'm saying is that a humanitarian element should take the fore right now, and not some Victorian Newlands and other nutcases in Washington that wanting to score points over a conflict of 25 years ago and demonizing a country that actually can do something positive in the Middle East when the U.S. has had a catastrophic run for the last 15 years. It's time to take a new look. Just like Jeremy, a time to take a new look at policy. What do you think about that, Richard? Go ahead.
Well, I'm always in favor of taking new looks, but you can't forget the past. You can't forget some of the reasons that were solid reasons behind the Cold War antipathy between Washington and Moscow. Does the current effort by Moscow signal a national interest to advance, to retain Assad, to please the Iranians? All of these questions are out there demanding answers, and there aren't any good answers. So I agree. Let's sit with the Russians. Let's talk. And Obama and Kerry have both said, let's get started. Let's find a way out of this.
Okay.
It's a humanitarian catastrophe.
Exactly, and it's man-made, and it was made in Washington for the most part. That's my whole point here.
Peter,
we wouldn't have refugees if we didn't have wars of choice. One war of choice after another. I mean, after Libya, didn't anybody learn anything? And now it continues. This is just, this is criminal, this kind of mindset here. I'm sorry. Scott, go ahead. Jump in.
Yeah. Peter, I would just say Vladimir Putin should not be asking permission from the West or the United States how it conducts himself in this whole Syrian Europe mess. Vladimir Putin needs to step in and take leadership and say to the Europeans, look, we represent you. We're for your stability and safety and order. Let us help you. Let us work together. Let us stem this and not just open the borders and turn this into a mass refugee relocation program. Your concern is to your borders and your citizens. We're concerned about that because, as it's been said before, some of these people could be launching military attacks in Europe and in Russia. The Europeans will side with Russia. The Europeans will side with Putin, and they will slowly divorce themselves from the U.S.
Scott,
and the U.S. policies
Scott, we're
because
rapidly
they will see
running out of time,
these
Scott.
policies are
I mean, with
destroying
the sanctions because of Ukraine, I don't have any confidence in the Europeans at all. Zero. They work against their own national interests time after again.
I don't think that reconciliation between Russia and Europe is going to occur anytime soon.
Okay.
And I don't think we should be rushing to place bets on that.
Okay, Kapil, let me ask you a question. Let me ask you a question, you know, being the representative of the global south, if I can say that on this program here. It looks to me is that the U.S. really likes the fact that ISIS is tearing up the entire region. They don't want to destroy ISIS. They want to control it. They want to be able to control it and leash it on their enemies. Do you like that thesis or not? Go ahead.
You know what, Peter, I will just say that the International Red Cross released a report and said Yemen after 5 months looks like Syria after 5 years.
Yeah.
We don't care about the suffering of people when they don't matter. Saudi Arabia is bombing Yemen day and night, and we don't talk about that. And, you know, George Orwell wrote an essay in 1939 in which he said Western ideas of its own superiority are based on what he called an unspoken clause. And the unspoken clause, in his words, was not counting niggers. We never count the victims of our own atrocities. That's why we continue to assume that we are superior to everyone else. And that attitude needs to change.
Richard, 40 seconds left in the program. Last word goes to you.
I think it is.
Go ahead.
I think that attitude began to change when people realized that the policy in Iraq had been a major failure. And I don't think we are inspired by an idea of somehow supporting ISIS as a weapon against our enemies to achieve hegemony. I think the American people and perhaps even the administration are damn well tired of thinking they have the responsibility and the power to change events in the Middle East.
But Ambassador Murphy, with all respect, the appetite to interfere in other countries